Hello, this is Domenico with Easynomics, and we're going to revisit indirect taxes, excise taxes. We're going to look at the market for packs of cigarettes in the state of New York. And I'm going to create maybe 2, 3 videos leading up to kind of paper 3 type questions with an indirect tax, and also break down the supply curve and the supply curve that includes the tax in the model. Last week and this week, I got some really great questions from my students. And I think this video is going to help us kind of better understand where the firm is operating along within the model. And that's going to be the goal for this video and the next couple of videos within this little series. This will again be part of a microeconomic playlist. So if you scroll down, here we have playlists for microeconomics, and indirect taxes, excise taxes are under government intervention. So you can find the video in that playlist. In addition, you can simply search for particular videos by using the magnifying glass here. So excise taxes. Excise taxes in the United States, it's an indirect tax. It's a tax levied on the producer. And excise taxes are kind of particular taxes on goods that are considered demerit goods, have a negative consumption quality to them, where we don't want too much consumption or abuse of these goods, such as gasoline, because it releases carbon to the atmosphere, diesel fuel, alcohol, because of its negative effects from overconsumption, its addictive quality, leading to different types of social problems, and tobacco products because of the negative health impacts. So these are the goods in the US that have an excise tax, a tax levied on the producer on the manufactured good. And this provides us a little bit of a background. Here it says that at the national level, federal excise taxes generated $86.8 billion in fiscal year 2020. Of that, we have fuel taxes applied at the federal level. And then we have here tobacco, which is going to be the focus for this video. And tobacco taxes raised $12.4 billion in fiscal year 2020. Okay. Um, Cigarette taxes in the United States, in terms of its history, it goes back quite a bit to almost the beginning of the United States. 1794, the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, Alexander Hamilton, introduced the first ever federal excise tax on tobacco. And then during the Civil War, the United States Congress passed excise taxes on a variety of items, which included tobacco. And this was a means to generate more tax revenue to pay for the war effort. Again, in this video, we're going to look at the state of New York, and I've chosen the state of New York for a reason. It has the highest tax on a pack of cigarettes in the US. Here we can see that New York has a tax on average, or sorry, not a tax, but the price of a pack of cigarettes is $11.96. So I'm going to use $12 as our real value within the model, just to make it rounded up to 12. And then the next state with the highest price per pack is Rhode Island at 11.71. What's interesting about the U.S. Enabling states to determine their own state taxes on on demerit goods like tobacco is that if New York has the highest price for a pack of cigarettes and it's surrounded by states that have prices on average for a pack of cigarettes that's less than that of New York, well, that creates an incentive for residents of New York to cross state lines and buy cigarettes at the lower price within those states. It also provides an opportunity for organized crime to buy cigarettes across state lines, bring them back into the state of New York, and perhaps sell them in parallel or black markets. That could be an interesting internal assessment or maybe an extended essay, just putting it out there. But here we see the cheaper substitutes being offered around the state of New York. And then we can question whether the state of New York raising the price that high is a good policy, or does it create increased black and parallel markets within that state? What's the quantity of consumption? How many packs of cigarettes are sold per year? I was able to find some information, Here we can see that on the y-axis we're measuring total packs sold in millions. Luckily, we see that there's a downward trend, which is good news. New Yorkers are consuming less, or perhaps this is less legal consumption, where people are consuming more cigarettes in the parallel markets, which is not documented here, but I'm just speculating on that. So in 2021, we see that there was about 250 million packs of cigarettes bought and sold. So 250 million. Okay, so that's the quantity of consumption. A recent article from Forbes magazine highlights how the state of New York raised their state tax on a pack of cigarettes to the highest in the United States, to $5.35 per pack. For my model, I'm just going to keep it simple, keep it at $5 per pack as a per unit tax applied. The article goes on to highlight that throughout the U.S., you have a variety of different state taxes applied to tobacco or packs of cigarettes, with New York again being the highest at $5.35. Again, it's surrounded by other states that don't have a state tax per pack that's as that high. So again, it creates that incentive for New Yorkers or organized crime to cross state lines and buy the cheaper alternatives and bring that back in and sell it in the parallel or black markets. This article also refers to a study in 2012 by the Congressional Budget Office that determined the PED value of cigarettes, and they determined that was 0.3. So here we see that for every 1% rise in the price of cigarettes, it would result in a 0.3 decline in the quantity of consumption. So PED is 0.3 according to this study. I'll provide a link in the video notes below to that study if you're curious. Here's that study here from 2012. And so let's go ahead and begin. So here we have two models. Graph A, the market for a manufactured good with an applied per unit indirect tax. And then we'll move on to graph B, market for packs of cigarettes in the state of New York with the applied per unit state tax in New York. So let's illustrate in graph A first the supply curve. And I'm going to keep the supply curve relatively elastic. So here's S1 equal to the marginal costs of production. And I'm keeping an elastic supply curve because I'm assuming that the determinants of PES, since it's a manufactured good, and firms producing tobacco have the ability to store stock. They have warehouses where they can store. And if that's the case, then the supply curve would be relatively elastic. It's a finished product. They just have to ship it out. So as demand increases or decreases, they can quickly increase or decrease the quantity of supply. You can also assume that there might be spare capacity within the factories that are producing tobacco. Perhaps the rate at which costs of production is not increasing isn't increasing rapidly. Perhaps also we can assume within the manufactured plants that the mobility of factors of production is quite smooth. So for those reasons, I'm illustrating a manufactured good with a relatively elastic supply curve. And I want to highlight to you, as I was highlighting to my students, that we got to remember that the supply curve is the sum of all the factors of production. So the distance between the x-axis and the S1 curve is the sum of all the land, labor, and capital costs. Okay, so that distance is representing the cost of land resources like tobacco. Tobacco is grown on the land, and that cost is rent. That's also the cost of labor resources, and firms that produce tobacco are paying wages. That's also the cost of capital resources. And for capital, firms are paying out interest. Okay, so from the x-axis up to the supply curve, that's the sum of the cost of land, labor, and capital resources. So when we draw this model, we really want to be mindful that the firm is always operating along the S1 curve, right? That does not change. They're always operating along the S1 curve. They're producing packs of tobacco and the cost of producing, the marginal cost of producing that tobacco, that includes the cost of rent, wages, and interest, is all along that S1 curve. So let's not lose sight of that as we draw the indirect tax. Okay, for graph A, I'm not going to draw a very inelastic demand curve, even though tobacco is very addictive and it would have a very inelastic demand curve. To illustrate a particular point in graph A, I'm just going to draw a relatively unit elastic demand curve, all right, for a purpose, which you're going to see. So here's my demand curve. And demand is equal to the marginal benefit. So that sets an equilibrium where S1 equals D1. All right, I'll label this point A. That will generate a free market equilibrium price at equilibrium, and a free market quantity equilibrium at QE. At QE, the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. So firms are producing from 0 up to QE. That's the quantity supply. Consumers are demanding from 0 up to QE, and so they are equal to each other at point A. Fine. So I'm going to provide a number here. Let's say that the cost per unit, the marginal cost per unit at a quantity of QE, let's say per pack of cigarettes, is $8. Okay, so we have $8 per pack to cover all the marginal costs of production to produce a quantity from 0 to QE, perhaps from 0 to 250 million packs per year. Then a government steps in, they apply a per unit indirect tax. So for each unit produced, there is a specific fixed tax applied. That tax does not change. So it could be $5, like we saw in the state of New York. We're applying a $5 tax on top of the marginal cost of producing. So that the product is produced, the pack of cigarettes is done, it's sitting in a warehouse, and the government steps in and says, well, you must pay $5 for each of those units. So that is the additional or final cost of production. So the supply curve will shift upwards in parallel by the amount of that tax. So here I'm going to draw that second supply curve here. I'm going to label that S2 equals the original supply curve that includes the cost of land, labor, and capital, S1 plus the value of the tax. Thus, the distance between S2 and S1, right, that distance between S2 and S1 is the value of the tax. So the distance between here and here is $5. The distance between here and here is $5. So that's the tax. That's the final cost of production. And we know that taxes are a supply curve shifter. So it shifts upward or inward by the amount of that tax. So we can imagine that the cost of production has gone up. Rent for land, wages for labor, interest for capital, and then there's this additional cost tax that we're adding. We can also state that it's shifting inward by the amount of that. Fine. So students in my class were asking, okay, you're at point A, you're producing a quantity of QE, so just add the tax on top. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to add the tax, and so that's going to be $5 added. And why not sell at that particular price? So let's try that. So here we are. We're going to add $5 to 8, and 8 plus 5 is 13. So here we have a price paid by the consumer. And 8 plus 5 gives us a price of 13. Okay, 13. So why don't we just do that? Fine, we're at this point. But there's a problem here. We're out of equilibrium in terms of the quantity. So no longer is quantity supplied and demanded equal. So the quantity of supply will continue to exist at QE. Firms are supplying up to QE. They're adding that tax. They're hoping that consumers will buy. So that takes us to this point here, point B. But according to the law of demand, the quantity of demand decreases as price rises. So the quantity of demand, that's a movement along the demand curve. Consumers are reducing their quantity of demand for these very expensive cigarettes. Originally it was at $8, now it's $13. It's a little bit too much. So consumers are scaling back their consumption. And so here we have the quantity of demand. All right, so that's going to lead to excess supply. So here we have quantity of demand being less than the quantity of supply. So here we have excess supply. And we've learned that the price mechanism will take effect. We have too much being produced. That's going to put downward pressure on the price. Price will start to fall. All right, we've produced too many cigarettes. Firms are going to find a way of eliminating the excess supply by just reducing price, and quantity of demand will increase and the quantity of supply will be consumed. But keep in mind, where is the firm? The firm's always operating along their S1 curve. So they're at QE, they add the tax, they experience excess supply, so they're going to have to scale back production. And that scaling back of production is going to occur along the original supply curve, the S1 curve. So they're going to scale back, all right, along the original supply curve. They're going to fire excess resources. They're going to fire unused labor, land, capital resources because they're scaling back their production along their S1 curve, all right? And they're going to scale that back until the quantity supply is being consumed by the quantity of demand. All right, so I just went back a little bit too far here. Okay, so where are they going to scale back until? All right, they're going to scale back until quantity supply is equal to quantity demanded, which is going to occur. See if I can find a color that really pops out here. Maybe we'll use this dark gray. They're going to scale back up until right here. So the quantity supply is decreasing, all right? Decreasing, 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 decreasing. Quantity supply is decreased to this point. So here's the quantity of supply. They're scaling back that production. And they stop. That's the marginal cost of land, labor, and capital resources. And then they're going to add the tax. And when they add that tax, that's going to take us, all right, so here they are. They add the tax. And it's going to take us to this point here. A, B, C, I'll label this point D. And at that point, they can lower price. Price has been reduced. And let's say that that price is $12. So price has fallen by $1 by the firm reducing the quantity of production. Price falls. Quantity of demand increases along the demand curve from point C to D. And then we see at the end that we're at a new equilibrium. So at this point here, right, at this new equilibrium, quantity equilibrium 1, quantity equilibrium 2, at QE2, quantity of supply is equal to quantity demanded. We have eliminated the excess supply. Originally, we had quantity supply here at a price of 13. We had quantity of demand here at a price of 13. And now it's reached new equilibrium at QE2. Okay, so that was a discussion that was brought up in class, which was, I thought was quite useful, just to highlight again that firms are operating all along their S1 curve, right? The S2 curve is just that added tax, but the firms are always increasing, decreasing quantity supply along the S1 curve. At point A, they add the tax, too much is produced, so they scale back production. And as they scale back production, they reach finally a new equilibrium at QE2, where they apply the tax, and price decreases for the consumer at 12, quantity demand increases, quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded, and so on. Now, what about the price received by the producer? The producer does not get to keep the tax. So 12 minus 5, the producer is left with a price of 7. So the price for the producer has decreased. Okay, so the tax revenue generated at the end of this process is right here in this boxed area that we can see there. Okay, now on a test you would have been drawing all of this. This gets quite complicated and sophisticated. We keep it simple. So in graph B, we'll show the simplified model that we'll use. So again, I'm going to draw a supply curve that's relatively elastic. Here's S1 equal to the marginal cost of production. And then I'm going to draw an inelastic demand curve because this is for packs of cigarettes and has an addictive quality to it. So there's a relatively steep demand curve. Demand equals marginal benefit, and that sets an equilibrium. And that equilibrium is where S1 equals D1. So we're going to label that price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium. So price equilibrium, quantity equilibrium. Here is point A. And then we're going to apply a per unit tax. So a per cigarette pack tax of, let's say, $5 just to keep it simple. So the supply curve is going to shift up by $5. We've produced all of these manufactured finished packs of cigarettes. So the supply curve will just shift up to S2, which is equal to S1 plus the $5 tax. That's a parallel shift upward. So the distance between S2 and S1 is always going to be $5. Then we look where S2 equals D1, which is right here at point B. And that raises the price paid by the consumer. Consumers pay a higher price at PC, and that reduces the price received by the producer to P and P, price received by producer. Okay, and then I'll call this quantity with tax. So on an exam, you would draw this as opposed to what I've drawn in graph A. And then I'll label this point C. And then I'll go ahead and label some areas so I can evaluate its impact on consumer and producer surplus. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and I there. All right. So I'm going to provide an analysis of graph B because this would be the model that you would be using on an IB exam, and then we will evaluate it. And that will be the end of this video. Later, I will link this video to a paper 3 type practice question using this kind of information, $5 tax and quantity of consumption, 250 million packs and so forth. So look out for that paper 3 practice. So in graph B, here we have the market for packs of cigarettes in New York State, where a per pack tax is applied, being $5. On the y-axis, we're measuring price. On the x-axis, we're measuring quantity. We have one downward sloping demand curve according to the law of demand, labeled D1 equal to the marginal benefit. We have two upward sloping supply curves labeled S1 and S2. Both are equal to the marginal cost of production. The marginal cost includes the cost of employing land, labor, and capital resources. S2 is equal to S1, land, labor, and capital marginal costs, plus the tax as an additional cost, and the tax being a non-price determinant of supply, shifting the supply curve upward or inward. Where S1 equals D1 at point A, we have a free market equilibrium price established at PE and a free market equilibrium quantity established at QE. Because the government or state of New York determines that cigarettes are not good for consumption, that it has led to significant health problems, and perhaps the public health services are paying quite a bit, and the opportunity cost of the tax revenue allocated towards treating people with cigarette problems like lung disease and cancer. We want to be able to internalize that cost. So the state of New York raises the tax per pack by $5, shifting the supply curve upward or inward by the amount of $5 from S1 to S2, which is equal to S1 plus the tax. That has the effect of increasing the price paid by consumers from PE to PC, price paid by consumer, which reduces the quantity of demand, which is a movement along the demand curve from point A to point B, or from QE to quantity at tax. This also reduces the price received by the producer because the producer does not keep the tax revenue. So it falls from PE to P&P, reducing the quantity supplied from point A to C or from QE to Q tax. So at Q tax, we can see that the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity of demand. So that would be my analysis. Now let's go ahead and evaluate the effects of the tax on stakeholders. So stakeholders are negatively affected by the tax because originally they had a consumer surplus as we follow the demand curve down to the equilibrium price of PE. The original consumer surplus area was areas A plus B plus C plus D. But then it is reduced because of the higher price to area A. Indirect taxes are a regressive tax, so this has a significantly negative impact on low-income households that are addicted to tobacco. It really reduces their savings. What about producers? Producers are negatively impacted because we can see that the original producer surplus, as we follow the supply curve to the original free market equilibrium price, included areas E plus F plus G plus H plus I, but it's reduced to areas H plus I. So reduced producer surplus for the producers of tobacco. The government or the state of New York benefits because they're able to collect the tax revenue applied to packs of cigarettes, and the tax revenue collected is equal to areas B plus C plus E plus F. All right, so that is tax revenue equal to areas B plus C plus E plus F, which is equal to the price paid by the consumer minus the price received by the producer multiplied by the quantity consumed at quantity tax. In addition, workers in the tobacco industry are negatively affected because firms are reducing their quantity of production from point A to C or from QE to Q tax. So they have to unemploy factors of production like labor, perhaps some land resources and capital resources. And last, what about society as a whole? Society, in theory, is negatively affected because there's an under allocation of resources. We can see at quantity tax, in theory, at point B, the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost here and here. There's an under allocation of resources to tobacco firms to produce the quantity of packs of cigarettes desired by society, if it was considered desirable. And that generates a welfare loss of areas D and G, which is the triangular area here. I'll darken that a bit so we can see a little bit better. Okay, and that's it. So there we have graphed, analyzed, and evaluated the effect of a per unit indirect excise tax on cigarettes, assuming that it's not negative consumption. Later on, there'll be links to negative consumption models where taxes correct the overallocation of resources to tobacco. We don't want that level of consumption. But look out, I'll provide a paper 3 practice question using graph B as our applied example. If you have any questions, feel free to comment those questions below. And don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.